Three, two, one, and we are live on Counterbalance. Hello. Today,
Hi,
this
Mike.
is the, oh, hi, Gadi. This is the Counterbalance Israel Affairs edition. Counterbalance being the fastest growing television station in the United States. And today, it is our honor to welcome Ed Husain from London. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Gadi.
Hi, hello there.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. And great to see you both in two important capitals from London here.
It's wonderful to have you. And Ed, let me just tell you a little bit about yourself for our viewers. You are a prominent British Muslim intellectual. You are a former Islamist. You've written two best-selling books, one of them called The Islamist. You are an advisor to senior government leaders in the UK, but also in the Middle East. You've spent lots of time in the Middle East. You speak Arabic. You are an advisor about the geopolitics of the Middle East. But you're also an activist in Britain for a pluralistic Islam. And that makes you a very controversial figure. And if you'll permit me for 1 second, Ed, I want to tell Gadi why I love you, or when I started to love you. I was once in Britain. I've told you this, Ed, yourself.
Ed, you can sense he's not a Protestant, right? Protestants
No.
don't say things like that.
No, I'm a Catholic, and you, Gadi, you are a Jew, and Ed is a Muslim. This is a Catholic, a Jew, and a Muslim got onto YouTube edition of Counterbalance. The
interfaith Counterbalance.
The bad ethnic joke edition of Counterbalance. No, but Gadi, let me tell you about Ed. I was in Britain once, and I was listening to the radio, and Red Kin was on the radio. Red Kin Livingston, the former mayor of London.
Yeah,
we
love him, you know.
Yeah, they love him in Israel. Of course, they would appear on Press TV, the Iranian television program. He likes Hezbollah figures. He's actually a very, in all honesty, he's kind of a likable guy. It's just that he has horrendous views, but he's also intelligent. Anyway, he was on the radio debating with this young Muslim guy who kicked his butt. Left, right, and center. He just wiped the floor with him in debate. And believe me, Red Kin is not an easy guy to debate. And I thought, who is this? And I listened at the end, and they said, and this is Ed Husain, author of The Islamist. And from that moment, I fell in love with Ed. But then when I was in government back in about 2008, I was in the Defense Department. And I went over to London, and the British police took me to some godforsaken place where they were doing work with outreach to radicalized Muslims, and I was talking to this Muslim guy, a beard and so on, and I said, "Do you know this guy, Ed Husain?" And he just got fire in his eyes, and I don't remember exactly what he said. Something like, he's not a Muslim, and I'd like to rip his lungs out. Something like that, and
Very pleasant.
so. Yeah, he probably was a little nicer than that. He probably said, I'd like to strangle him. But anyway, it just told me, that little interlude, the little exchange. It just told me, how much controversy you have kicked up, and how courageous you are. So after that long introduction, welcome, Ed. Great to have you here.
Mike, thank you very much. And those kind words mean so much coming from you, because I spent 5 years living in the United States of America, Gadi, and there, almost on a nightly basis, there was a period of time when Mike was on CNN, no less, with Anderson Cooper, constantly attacking the Obama administration's Iran policy. And those were tough days. And Mike was on a nightly basis, attacking not just the Syrian regime, but also attacking its greatest supporter, i.e. the Iranians. So, hats off to you, Mike, for being a visionary and seeing where the Middle East was heading. And I think right now we take all this for granted, but it was your steering the debate at a very difficult time that has brought the Middle East in many ways to where it is today, and American public opinion, and more importantly, the White House, broadly supportive of your position.
Oh, listen, thank you. That's far too kind. Let's get off of me, as much as I like talking about me. And let's
And let's talk about your work now.
let's talk about my work. Yeah, let's talk about what you feel, more about what you feel about me. No, you're here today, Ed, because you wrote this amazing article about Israel, in which you advised British Jews to stop bashing Bibi-Netanyahu, and we're sharing it on the screen right now. And you started out, you said, Israel's under attack again, not from the usual suspects of Hamas or Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not Jewish, but a Muslim who wants to see a long-lasting, real peace between Israel and her Arab allies. And you complain that liberal Jews in Britain are attacking Bibi Netanyahu, and they should stop doing it. I've never seen an article by a Muslim like this before. What prompted you to write it?
I hope that we will have many more Muslims writing in public what thousands of us are discussing, feeling in private. And I'd go further, millions across the Arab world are in that position, because British Jews, and I include American Jews in this too, that there's a sentiment that whatever the politics of Jews in the West, left, center, right, they're transplanting that politics into the difficult scenario that is Israel's existence in the Middle East. And yes, you can be left-leaning here, but when I say here in London, in the UK, you've just produced Jeremy Corbyn from the left. Having just recovered from an anti-Semite heading up the left in the UK, your priorities ought to be focusing on rebalancing and better educating the Labour Party on anti-Semitism, not lecturing to the Israeli government, which increasingly looks like a coalition between Benny Gantz and Prime Minister Netanyahu, on how they ought to fight Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Fatah, PLO, and others. And so that's the first concern. The second concern is the British and the American far left-leaning Jewish voice against Israel and against Prime Minister Netanyahu puts something much more important at risk, and that is the new opening between Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, and indeed, a much warmer public relationship from Cairo and other Arab capitals. I'm thinking here of Morocco, a little bit more from Algeria, and others will follow this new momentum that's in place. That all gets jeopardized if British Jews start to lobby, or left-leaning British Jewish community members start to lobby the British government, and American left-leaning Jewish organizations start to lobby Congress to attack Bibi Netanyahu's potential plans on extending Israeli sovereignty. So my point is this, that they're missing two great issues. In other words, you've got fights on your own doorstep here in the West in relation to anti-Semitism that you need to fight on the left. And then you're ignoring the wider reality in the Middle East, where, whether we like it or not, Bibi Netanyahu has new, deep, and long-lasting relations with Arab neighbors that are aligned against the real threat, which is Iran. So rather than fight the real fire, too many British Jews, especially of the left, are going down the rabbit hole of fighting the battles of the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years. So my point is that you're out of date. There's a much, much bigger set of issues at stake which you need to get educated on. So that was the thinking behind the intervention.
Ed, let me add a footnote to what you're saying. I'm sure you figured that out in London, but partly what I think Jews in Britain and other places, liberal Jews in America especially, with them we have the most traction, is they are trying to settle their own conscience vis-a-vis their neighbor. They're virtue signaling to their neighbors through us. So they want us to be an example of what would make the Gentiles like them. And we are not here in order to be a demonstration of anything. We are not a moral fable for anyone. We are a sovereign country and we have really serious problems. And we're not only dealing with our conscience. So to read something like that from a Muslim in Britain is fresh water here in Tel Aviv.
Well, thank you. And see, I hadn't thought about that. My whole point was that Jews and others in the West have our own virtue signaling issues, so deal with that. But you're absolutely right. Why should Israel be the sacrificial lamb to anyone else's conscience here in the West? And why should Israel be held to a barometer, by the way, which we won't hold China to, India to, Russia to? Anyway, we digress. But I welcome your direct punch on this one.
And it's partly, Mike. I'm sorry. I'm just there. It's for me like I want to give you my reactions on this, because I think, if I may share internal Jewish things here, is that I think Zionism rebelled against the idea that Jews will be ethereal, outwardly, live in a spiritual sphere where we are never guilty of anything. And Zionism said, no, it's irresponsible. If you want to be a moral person, you need to have power, not to be an eternal victim and be power. You need to have power and exercise power in the world, because without power, you can't make any change. And this is, I hope I'm not Mike, attacking your fellow Jewish countrymen too severely, but it gets on our nerves here in Israel when we are just supposed to be an example of something, and the idea that this romance of Jewish powerlessness, and it's not like Jews in America don't have power, right?
Right. I see here a couple of other angles, though, that are worth exploring, I think. One of them is there's a political argument going on in Britain that Ed is participating in, and then there's also an intra-Muslim one. So there's the intra-Jewish, there's the political, and then there's the intra-Muslim. Let's take them in order. Let's start with the political argument. I mean, Ed, you didn't just, and then there's another one too. There's also a personal one, Ed, your sort of personal journey. But you didn't just get up one morning and think you'll write this article, Ed. You were responding to something. What were you? Who were you responding to? You don't name names in the article, but let's get.
No, you're absolutely right, Mike. It was a response to three particular dynamics. One was large sections of the British Jewish left, led by a leader who I don't want to name, maybe for libel concerns here in the UK. Our libel laws are stronger than yours in America, but you can probably say that and get away with it. I don't know if I can, but there was a publication. Actually, I should. What's there to be afraid of?
Well, let me make life a little easier for you. There's a figure I've heard of named Mick Davis. Would it be someone of that sort, with that kind of profile? A successful businessman, very much, let's see, he's a former South African, very guy? Much, oh, there we go. He wrote an article, which we see right here in Jewish News, saying that Israel's leaders are violating our values, precisely because of the Netanyahu-Gantz agreement over the new government and the intention to annex the Jordan Valley. He is up in arms. Is that the sort of thing, Ed, that you were responding to?
Yes. So Mick Davis is part of that whole trend of holding Israel to a different criteria, but also mobilizing voices inside Britain's Jewish communities, especially younger voices, which worries me, against the direction of travel in Israel. So yes, Mick Davis is certainly one voice that's probably most prominent. And I've never met Sir Mick, but I suspect it's his South African background. Again, it's fighting the wrong battle. Israel is not an apartheid state. If you've come out of that milieu, you're formed by that, and So that's one dynamic. The second dynamic is indeed what's going on inside the Labour Party, and the mobilisation of parliamentarians to lobby Downing Street and to lobby Boris Johnson to condemn any potential Israeli extension of sovereignty into land on which there are tens of thousands of Jewish families. And the third issue is this, that I always worry, and I should have made this more directly relevant in the article, that no one asks the question that in a future Palestinian state, A, where would the borders be, and B, what happens to Jewish people? Would this Palestinian state have Jewish citizens? And in the absence of any credible answer to that question, because the real answer is no, that Palestinian state does not foresee having Israeli or Jewish citizens, and therefore where Jewish people are settled down on the land, those lands ought to belong to a state that protects their interests, because after all, that's how Pakistan was formed. That's how Bangladesh was formed, separating Pakistan. And if the Indians can tolerate part of the land being, large sections of the land being cut off in order to maintain peace and stability, it's just normal for, I think, Muslims around the world that want to engage with this issue to realize that there are realities on the ground that we ought to account for. So there shouldn't be a kind of, oh no, this is a Muslim issue and we've all got to mobilize. Well, now look at Pakistan. How did Pakistan come into existence? Look at Bangladesh. How does that come into existence? I mean, we can carry on with the analogy. So my point was threefold, to reassure, sensible, moderate, centrist Jewish voices in the West that, you have allies in the Middle East. Secondly, to make the case for reality on the ground. And thirdly, to say to British parliamentarians, just stop the holier than thou attitude, get behind a White House plan that's backed with $50 billion over 10 years for the Palestinians. I don't remember anyone else putting that kind of cash up front for 10 years. So there's a wider strategic reasons for supporting and, making that argument in that article.
Do you assume, Ed, that the Palestinians would at any point agree to make their peace with Israel?
Not the current leaders. I mean, every time I've gone into Ramallah and met the existing crop of leaders, they are still much like the British Jewish left, stuck in a bygone world. And that said, you speak to younger Palestinians, be they in the West or be they indeed in the West Bank or in Eastern Jerusalem, you see a different attitude. They want jobs, they want to get married, they want to have cars, they want to travel, and more importantly, they want to welcome young Emiratis, young Bahrainis, young Saudis, and young Egyptians who can bring capital and recuperate and revive their economy. They're focused on real issues, and I don't want to give away too much, but private polling done by Saudis and others shows that Palestinian youth population under the age of 30 just wants to get on with their lives, and they don't wake up thinking about politics. They don't wake up thinking about the peace process. They don't wake up thinking about settlements. They just want to get on with their lives. And then my last point would be this: that when I go to Israel and then into the West Bank, but especially in Jerusalem, all the hotel staff, the young Arabs, the so-called settlements, the people, the plumbers, the builders, the construction workers, they're all young Arabs. So the boycott, it seems to me, is an obsession. The boycott, divestment, sanctions mindset seems to be an obsession among the elite. The elite of Fatah and the Hamas and others. But on the ground, you go into the hotels, and the reality is that from the reception to the hotel bar to the hotel restaurants to cleaning of the rooms, it's all done by young Arabs. And I speak to them, and they just don't have that complex of, oh, we hate Jews. They speak fluent Hebrew. So it's a different reality, I think, on the ground with young Arabs who just want to get on with life and be able to marry and have children and have families and live safely, rather than this whole old school resistance mindset. Those days, I think, if you speak to younger Arabs, those days are over.
So sorry, go ahead, Gadi.
I was going to ask do you get very angry reactions from Arabs in Britain, or Muslims in general in Britain, or just from the Labour left?
From the Labour left, yes, Gadi, but also it's interesting because I grew up with that whole anti-Israeli mindset, you know. And it's interesting we're speaking today because just about 2 hours ago, I learned that my headmistress at my primary school, Susie Palsland, passed away. And I learned only on her passing away that she was a Jewish lady who came to Britain in the late 1930s, early 40s, who was on the last train from Vienna. The subsequent train to her was then stopped, and we know where that train went. But she was on the last train from Vienna, and she came to London. And you know, she taught young Muslims like me in the East End. And it's poignant because of Leopoldstadt and Tom Stoppard's play on what happened in Leopoldstadt. And so, yes, young British Jews on the left, but they forget those lessons of 1890s Germany and Austria, that, you know, you forget your Jewishness and you try to become more left than the left. It doesn't work because we've seen this before. And I think we're going through a similar difficulty with Muslims here in the West. Many of them have become very left-leaning. Weirdly, they support center-right political parties in the Muslim world. So they're supporting, say, the AKP in Turkey or Al-Nahda in Tunisia. But here in the West, they're with the far left wing of the Labour Party. So with George Galloway and Jeremy Corbyn and Ken Livingstone that Mike mentioned earlier. So that far left brigade, has attacked me online and kind of called me all kinds of names. But in many ways, if those people didn't respond, I'd be worried, because it's almost like saying, you're not posing a threat to the narrative. And they're behind Iran. So, and that worries me, you know, when the Iranians and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Muslim far left, as well as the Jewish far left, combine as a force against the daily reality of being Israeli. You know, it just shows that, you know, reality has become disfigured and discontorted in their minds.
But you must also be attacked as you were back in 2008 when I was in Britain. You must be being attacked by the Islamist contingent in Britain. Are you not? Have they paid attention to this article? Have they used it to attack you?
Yes, I've seen attacks from people who are broadly Islamist, whether they're backed by hostile forces in the Gulf or whether they're supportive of, so all of this stuff will be watched by them. So I'm just conscious I don't want to name them and give them the emotional validation that they're being noticed, because, you know, there's a beautiful saying in Arabic that there's a train, you know, that's on a track and it's traveling, and the dogs are barking. Let them bark. I mean, look where we are in the Middle East, Mike. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, when you were warning about Wahhabism on the right, they're on the back foot. You have a crown prince in Saudi Arabia, for all of his flaws, is focused on undoing Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. Look where the Muslim Brotherhood is. You know, for the first time since we've been focusing on this issue, Mike, and Gadi, they're on the back foot. So their allies in the West just can't make sense of what's going on. And the only people that will embrace them and give them warmth is the far left of the Labour Party. But guess what? We have Sir Keir Starmer now, who seems to be more of a Blairite centrist politician, that has no time for any of this kind of victimhood narrative. So we're seeing real shifts, and, you know, we ought to be supportive of those moves and help those guys come and join the sensible bandwagon towards peace and stability. Because, you know, I don't want to hold myself up as an example, but it's just not me. Hundreds and thousands of others who've joined the sensible centre have also been on that journey. I mean, I just say, you know, people like Tony Blair were far left in the student days. Now look where they are. You know, so we can all move and change. And I think an invitation ought to be going out to our friends that stop being on the fringes and being protesters, come into the wide narrative of what the Emiratis call the Abrahamic family home. You know, Jews, Christians, Muslims, all working together for a better world.
So you know, you say the left is attacking you, but the two-state solution is presented now as sort of centrist, and I would say that in the foreign policy establishment, it's considered the centrist position. It's still, I think, the preferred position. The annexation of the Jordan Valley is presented as a great threat to the two-state solution. And there's a mobilization going on here in Washington to present it as an extreme step and one that'll be very detrimental. So Two questions: are you getting heat from those types in Britain, the kind of mainstream foreign policy types, and secondly, from I would say, sort of centrist Jews who think, well, what the hell is this guy getting involved in our business?
On the foreign policy issue, because of COVID-19, I mean, I congratulate you for having a conversation for so long without mentioning COVID-19 or the Chinese virus, however we wish to phrase it, But
The Wu flu, we call it.
But so because of the distraction posed by the Wu flu, there hasn't been much focus on where Israel is potentially heading. But Secretary Pompeo visiting Jerusalem, despite the Wu flu, sent a very, very serious signal to our friends in Downing Street, but also those in the House of Commons and those who pay attention to British and Western foreign policy, that Secretary Pompeo got on a plane in the midst of Wu flu and took his team and met Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then came back after, I think, 12 hours on the ground. Take that seriously. Don't break that bond between Britain, the US, and Israel on some kind of lobbying from the far left and on the fears of upsetting Iran and its allies. So I think that's the message that's gone to the foreign policy establishment here. But in terms of blowback, it's been very. I mean, I've had calls from individuals and institutions that I don't want to name, but the bottom line is that they know that the direction of travel currently is in one direction. So you either get on board or you'll get trampled, and we've got to make sure that that's what continues. But yes, and this on your second point, that's what I found really astounding, and that worries me. And I must say, I mean, as someone who's a friend of Israel and a friend of Jewish people, but also someone who's an observant Muslim who takes Abraham, Solomon, David, Jacob, Joseph, Rebecca, indeed Isaac and Hagar and then Ismail seriously, because they were mentioned in the Quran as great prophets of God. What worries me is that this yes, Bani Israel is a tribe, and the Quran mentions Bani Israel as a tribe, but how dare you interfere in our affairs? I mean, someone who's supportive of Israel and Jewish issues comments on something and you get blowback. How dare you comment on our affairs? Whereas the Iranians and Hamas and Fatah are commenting on your affairs daily, and you're quite content having them as interlocutors. So that's what worries me, the kind of mental imbalance in that argument.
I think we live in the West, at least, in a world formed by sadly by Edward Said, and this explains a lot. It explains the first thing that you said that struck me, that while being on the left in your country, you support the extreme nationalists on the Arab front, and this is really, really typical of Israeli extreme leftists too. They are anti-national on the Israeli side, and yet they wholeheartedly support extreme nationalism on the Palestinian side. And then maybe the most egregious example was Azmi Bishara. I don't know if he's well known outside Israel, but he actually edited a collection about postmodernism. So he is a post-colonial Edward Saidian scholar, and then he went to support the Assad regime. He became an advisor for Bashar Assad. I think he's still there. Is he, Mike? Do you know?
No, I don't.
So this is one thing that's typical, and the other is in the Edward Said paradigm, you cannot criticize the other if the other is a victim. So this is what one of George W. Bush's speechwriters called, I think, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And so in the Arab world, you don't criticize anyone or anything because that's considered racist. While Jews, it's really a strange whirlpool, because we used to be the ultimate victims, but now we are not the other, we are the we. So I guess we were the other at the worst possible time, and then we became the us at the worst possible time. And we're not supposed to criticize Palestinians. And I think that what this did, it did the Palestinians no favor. They have become accustomed to never being accountable for their own fate. So first of all, it's extremely refreshing to to hear this coming from a Muslim saying, understanding the point of view of Israel and taking a pragmatic view of the whole conflict. But it's also, I think, politically important, because what Mike referred to as the centrist position is no longer a realistic position. And we've been cheating ourselves. We have been cheating ourselves because we have, at least we in Israel, have been thinking of the Palestinian national movement in our own image. So we thought that they were aiming at national self-determination, that is political independence, while they were really aiming at geographical return. So they are more like our religious settlers than they are like mainstream Zionism. And it's time to help the Palestinians wake up. And I see this rarely, I think, glimpses of this on memory. You two, shamefully, I don't speak or read Arabic, and you two do. But I read memory translation, memory.org translation. And increasingly, there have been voices saying things not as strongly as Ed put it in this article, but saying increasingly that the Palestinians should wean themselves off of this victimhood narrative.
Ed?
Yeah, no, see, I just listening to Gadi made me think about conversations with friends across Egypt, but also the Gulf. Something's changing. And by the way, this is I mean, 2 points. One, Muslims across the world don't see Jewish people as victims. We can point to periods in history in which, yes, Jewish people were victims of persecution, but I think it'd be remiss if we don't recall whether it's King Solomon or King David, you know, the great Jewish monarchs. And the concept of the nation state comes from the Israeli people's tenacity to holding on to that land, loving that land, defending that land. So it's worth bearing in mind that those big ideas come to us in the modern world from the way in which Jewish people have preserved civilization and big ideas. But on the question of the Palestinian peoples, what we're seeing, especially in the Gulf countries, is a twofold shift. And we ought to be alert to that, because this is a historical first. One, that the power capitals of the Middle East are no longer Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. That's changed now. Big ideas are not discussed in the media spaces or the publication space, or even the movies produced out of those three capitals. The great books and the great thinkers are no longer in those capitals. That's a huge shift from the Gamal Abdel Nasser days and the early days of Israel's founding, but the last 200 plus years of debate and discussion. The capitals that are most influential now are Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, the Gulf capitals. And there's a big shift. And that's my second point, that in those capitals, they don't share borders with Israel. They don't have the victim narrative with Israel. They meet Jewish representatives from the State Department, the White House, you know, the IMF, the World Bank, the big sovereign wealth funds, the private equity firms, and they see a complete affinity with the Jewish rabbis that visit them. I mean, it's another historical first that you have something being developed in the United Arab Emirates, a Jewish community actively being developed. We want a Jewish, vibrant community here. You know, so those are big firsts that ought to give us courage and hope for a different kind of Middle East in the future. So I'm not whistling in the wind, I don't think. And the reality on the ground with you know, the building of new synagogues and the welcoming of rabbis, but a recognition that Jewish people belong in the Middle East, are children of the Middle East, and they're entitled to their own state. And Palestinians come on board into Iraq, into Egypt, into Jordan, and if you want a two-state solution, let's give you travel documents, citizenship, and move around, travel around, just do what everyone else does, you know. And my last point would be this: I think Saudis and others in particular are sick and tired of being attacked by Palestinians in their mosques. I was in Jerusalem this time last year, and I prayed at the Masjid al-Aqsa, and I sent video recordings from the compound, the Temple Mount outside, where, you know, my old friends from Hizb ut-Tahrir that don't believe in the state of Israel, that believe in a global jihad, that are opposed to the United States and the West, I mean, they were gathered outside in open attacking Israel. And I sent that to two friends, one in Saudi Arabia, one in the United Arab Emirates, and both could not believe that these guys would have no time, no space, no mobilizing area in any of the Gulf Arab countries. And there they were in Israel, openly calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. So it's just strange having those conversations in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, and then you go to Jerusalem and you see, Palestinians calling for the destruction of Israel in Israel.
Ed, why did you, when did you first start going to Israel? And, I sense in you a transformation, that you've grabbed hold of this issue. What I'm driving at is that I sense a connection between your pushing this issue and your call for a pluralistic Islam in Britain. But I think that, if I were in your shoes, or many other people, they might think the thoughts that you're thinking, but they would just sort of avoid the Israel issue because it's such a can of worms. So something switched in you and made you decide to start hammering away on this issue in particular. And I wonder if my description of your transformation makes sense, and if it does, could you explain what was the switch that happened?
It's a very perceptive observation and an astute comment. For lots of us who've been on this journey, I mean, you've got to grow, you've got to move on. Nothing is the same in life. Yes, we abandoned dreams of an Islamist state. Yes, we stopped calling for jihad. Yes, we believed in gender equality. Yes, we thought being in the West and being westernized, being modernized was absolutely vital. Otherwise, we were living this cognitive dissonance. But somehow, Israel was always the exception. Suicide bombings are wrong, yes, but in Israel, they're right. Every state we recognize in the Westphalian system, yes, but not Israel. So Israel became this strange last refuge of the liberal Muslim to prove that they're still Muslim and still liberal, but not Israel. I'm with the radicals in Israel. I'm with Iran on Israel. My last credential of being truly resistant Muslim to the global hegemony, i.e. again, Edward Saidi and Marxist nonsense, is that I'm still prepared to bash Israel. And that troubled me. It just didn't seem right. And I think my last kind of openness on all that was when I was with you and others in America, Mike, that, I'd see Elliot Abrams and others. But yes, I recognize Israel, but I would make it my business to go on CNN and attack Naftali Bennett. It was just my way of virtual signaling to my Muslim audience that don't worry, I might be, contradicting you on other things, but on Israel, we're still, and that I just, at some point I thought that was wrong, but something happened physically, which was a very, very close friend of mine, watched my interviews, and let's call him Nathan. He said to me, have you been to Israel? And my point was, no, I hadn't been to Israel. So you've been across the Middle East, but you've never been to Israel. And his challenge was to me, if you're going to be intellectually honest about this, go and see Israel for yourself. And I did. And when I went to Israel, Nathan introduced me to rabbis, to imams, but again, in the hotels, I was shocked that there were Arabs at every point. In my conversations with Arab youth, I detected an openness with them and their willingness to recognize Israel and have peace that I didn't find with, people in the left here in the West bashing Israel. So that made me wake up. Now, what struck me is that the moment I started to talk about this in public, I had a response from Muslims, especially in Gulf Arab countries, that shocked me. That, as you said, they were thinking those thoughts, but sometimes it takes someone to just express them and they think, yeah, here's someone who I identify with. And that was a breath of fresh air, but also huge wind in the sails of those of us who were ardently Muslim, but ardently recognize our Jewish cousins' absolute right to be on that land and have their own country and return. And I say this, when in 1492, 30,000 Muslims were welcomed by the Ottoman Turks when they were persecuted in Spain. Now, it's in that spirit that we should welcome.
Jews, you mean?
Jewish people. Sorry, I don't know what I said. What did I say?
You said Muslims.
Forgive me, Muslims. But 30,000 Jewish people were welcomed. Bernard Lewis and others. We mentioned Edward Said. We should definitely mention Bernard Lewis, your mentor, but also a mentor to hundreds of others. Bernard Lewis was the first to remind so many of us of this, that the track record of Muslims by and large has been to welcome Jewish people. Now, when the Nazi persecution started, we should be the first to welcome Jewish people back and welcome that talent and that vitality and allow them to thrive in our midst, in the Muslim world. So I found all of that welcoming and refreshing when I expressed that people, especially in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and other countries, were applauding that. And we should never forget that that's where the new frontier is for Israel. Israel's tech hub mindset, innovation mindset, coupled with the young willingness in the Gulf countries and their financial ability to lift heavily, could genuinely fire up the region. So that's where my transformation comes from. It's ideas, but also reality.
Ed, I wanted to ask you two questions. I'll make them one, because the first one was about what were your impressions of Jewish Israelis when you came, and the other is I watched with amazement a video about you taking imams from England to visit Israel, and so what were their reactions? How was Israel different from their expectations?
Meeting Jewish Israelis was good fun because of seeing the similarities, but also the differences. You could identify the more hardline element with our hardline elements, and you could see the similar debates about liberalizing, modernizing, the challenges of the modern world. And as one of my friends from Saudi Arabia put it, below the waist, all Jewish, Israeli, and Muslim Arab men are the same. Sorry, Mike, that's a joke where you can't probably participate. But
actually, I can, because I'm an American, and our medical practices conform to your religious practices.
Okay, right. So we're all so alike in that's a comment from a prominent
also
Saudi.
America only exists above the waist. It's well known.
Anyhow, so on your question, lots of similarities in the warmth and the bondage and the kind of open expression, and what struck me was the understanding of scripture, the centrality of God. But I got that when I was living in New York. Here in England, God is more or less absent in the public domain. When I lived in New York, my bosses were Jewish. Council on Foreign Relations, we were doing open Jewish practices and prayers, and walking around seeing Hebrew everywhere. I mean, that shifted something inside me. So going to Israel was a natural onset of that. But you asked a second question, which
about the imams you took.
Yeah, the imams. Something really interesting happened, and I hope the imams will forgive me for saying this. The imams were moved to tears by Yad Vashem, going to Jerusalem and seeing the persecution that the Jewish people had suffered, because that isn't made clear often enough, and they were moved to tears by that. But at the same time, and I hope they forgive me for saying this, is that they realized that Sharia was applied more rigorously in personal law issues in Israel than it was here in the UK. And they came back wanting more of Israeli Arab implementation of Sharia, in terms of, the Israeli state would support with its police force to uphold the Sharia court's verdict on, custody laws. And so they came back wanting more Sharia in the UK. If Israel has it, why shouldn't Britain have it? So we had to hold them back, So that's how moved they were by seeing reality on the ground for Israeli Arab Muslims.
I'm going to try this argument on the Israeli left and the Israeli right, and let's see where I get scarred worse, on which side. If I told them that Israel is considered an example of upholding Sharia.
It is its judicial system and its courts. You have Sharia judges, and our imams want that, and the secular state is saying, no, we're not going down that route. So
that the whole thing is because we didn't abolish Turkish law in this country. So we have the millet system, in which this is for Jews, it's a backward characteristic of the state, or the backward characteristic of the state, that you can't marry outside of your religious affiliation. So people bring this as example to the Jewishness of the state, but that's not true. It's to the Ottomanish quality of the state, because we still have for every religion a different set of courts of marriage. To me personally, this was a problem. My wife isn't Jewish, so we married outside Israel.
I don't know that I can accept that on counterbalance, that kind of intermarriage. I don't know, Ed, can we agree that this is really a bad practice?
What intermarriage or intramarriage or marrying outside?
Intermarriage, well, that
Let me
Gadi just
protest that we have
got,
no representation for the Proto-Slavic religion here, but I can arrange that within a few meters if you want.
just, I'm just shocked to find that Gadi is married a non-Jew. This is, it's very upsetting.
We're working on conversion, Mike, but if you want to wait with me on counterbalance till after conversion, we can do that.
Okay. No. We'll make an exception. We'll grandfather you in here. So, Ed, the reactions, do they, the negative reactions I'm talking about, do they worry you at all? I mean, are they at a level that you actually feel threatened, or is this just usual for you and you feel validated when people are attacking you?
No, I think that, and forgive me if I sound excessively pious, but I think deep down people know this is the truth. And I'm not angling, I'm not positioning, I'm not politicizing this. You know, when something comes from the heart, it reaches the heart. This is the honest truth. That's the current direction of travel in the region. The old battles of yesterday are gone. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is nowhere to be seen or found. You know, the 1 year they were in power, they went to Iran twice. You know, so people have seen what they're about. And you know, so I think, you know, the people have attacked me, and you know, the couples, you know, the calls that have come through on my mobile phone. I think ultimately people know that the Jewish people have every right to be in the region, that the Gulf Arabs, you know, founders of Islam in Saudi Arabia, have every right to recognize their Jewish cousins. And the United States of America is fully moral in supporting Israel's every right to exist. And the Palestinians deserve justice. The Israelis deserve security. And that's what we should be working towards. So deep down in my waters, I feel right. And I think my enemies, our enemies, also know that this is God's honest truth. You can either be with the wrong side of history and support the devil in trying to undo. You know, I genuinely believe God's people having a God-given right and land back to them, or you can say, let's stop picking on the Jewish people. You know, it's been happening for 3,000 years. Let's just move on and focus on the real problems now in the world, which increasingly is China and Iran. That's the recognition you ought to veer people towards, I think.
So is this a religious-based argument or a self-determination democratic-based argument, or do they both just converge?
I think they both converge. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And this is where I disagree with some of our more hardline atheistic secular Jewish friends, because I think without, and this is entirely a practical point, the strongest argument that Israelis have with Muslims around the world is actually a religious argument. The moment you start talking about God, about Bani Israel, about the Quran, about Solomon, David, Abraham, circumcision, you know, you start to realize bonds. I mean, why is it that Jews and Muslims in Germany and Britain unite to protect circumcision and kosher and halal meat, but they can't unite to save lives in the Middle East? You know, so I think it's a religious argument, absolutely, because the starting point is God. And, you know, we've just finished reading the Quran this month, and you see multiple references to Musa. Moses is referenced more in the Quran than Muhammad, than Jesus. And that's got to be saying something, you know. I don't want to get down the whole kind of sectarian milieu and Hagerism and Patricia Crony, but there is something about Muhammad, you know, the Prophet of Islam, continuing that Mosaic message of the one God. And that's why, you know, what the Emiratis are doing resonates with me. Something called the Abrahamic family house, you know, building a synagogue, a church, and a mosque after, you know, the Pope being there last year, is marking a new mental transition in the region that recognize other people, recognize pluralism, recognize the validity of other religious traditions. And the moment you do that, Israel flows from that.
Would this argument also work in France, do you think? Because we in Israel see an influx of Jews from France, because they've been saying Muslim anti-Semitism is not reported in the press, but it has made their life hell, or some of them.
This is where France is the anomaly. You know, something happened in the English-speaking world here, John Locke and especially Edmund Burke's form of secularism allowed for religiously people to be visible in the public space. So the American Constitution, but also American politicians being visibly religious, but not making any one particular religious interpretation a matter of state policy. Whereas the French take a different approach. You know, Voltaire and Rousseau had an entirely different approach to secularism, which was much more confrontational. The state not being religiously neutral, but actually enforcing, you know, persecution of Catholicism, you know, the Voltaire's drive, leads today to persecution of Muslims. And therefore Muslims come and they have this anti-state approach. And Muslims who come from Algeria and other countries have an anti-Jewish approach. And all of that comes together and forms this inability to have this conversation on religious grounds. But you see in America and Britain and in Israel a different form of secularism, thanks, I think, primarily to Edmund Burke and John Locke, which is religious tolerance and pluralism that Jefferson and others embraced. And I think there's something in the English-speaking world and Israel that allows for a secular state, but a public space in which people of faith can have that religion and God-based conversation without shoving it down each other's throats.
Ed, do you think when you make these religiously based or religiously tinged arguments with fellow Muslims about opening up to Israel, do you find that your words ring true to them, or do they look at you as having a very idiosyncratic take on the religion? I mean, what I'm asking is, how representative do you think you are of an identifiable religious trend among British Muslims or Muslims in general?
British Muslims are behind on this one because most British Muslims sadly have veered towards the left and ended up in positions saying, oh, Ashkenazi Jews are not really the children of Abraham and of Moses. They're basically Polish, Lithuanian, you know, Russian. They're not really Jews. You know, so they've ended up in this racist position and denying history. Now, when I take imams to Jerusalem, or when I don't want to overstate the case, but honestly, when you're in the Gulf and you have these conversations, they immediately get it, because one of the, you know, I was with my friend Nathan that I mentioned earlier, the friend of an Arab prince in Dubai, and we had this lady who was from a very prominent Arab tribe in Saudi Arabia just come over for 2 nights, and we were talking to her about Israel, and she said, oh yeah, you know, my ancestors were Jewish. We know that from our tribal lineage. So this is not an isolated incident. Many of the Arab tribes realized that, you know, some of the wars that happened at the time of Muhammad meant that many tribes were forcefully converted, and they realized their heritage, many of them were Jewish. Now, it's easy when you read the Quran and you see references to Bani Israel, references to settling the land, references to Sayyidina Umar, the second caliph, bringing Jewish people back after 5 centuries of Roman expulsion, Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, a prominent Sufi in Morocco, aligning himself very prominently with Jewish people, the Ottomans welcoming Jewish people back. The history is long, and Dory Gold is really good at this in Jerusalem, in highlighting this history, as was Bernard Lewis. But the point is, I don't think I'm idiosyncratic at all. I think I'm reminding Muslims of a much longer history that's not just about resistance to Israel in the last 60 years, but transcends that, going back to Muhammad and all the way back to Abraham. And the best example of that, again, is the awakening in Gulf Arab countries. And just look, this Ramadan, the Harun, you know, mother of Aaron, controversial conversations across the Arab media and online space about the return of Jewish people back to their ancestral homelands and why it's valid. So I don't think for a moment that I'm an isolated voice. But that said, I think in the West, among Muslims in the West that are too closely aligned to the far left, Israel has become this political tool with which they identify. I mean, look at your 2 lady, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. You know, for them, Israel is a convenient whipping boy for their domestic politics. But take it to the religious and historical level, you see a different set of conclusions.
This is where Edward Said embraces the Edward Said frame of mind, embraces the anti-Semitic frame of mind. So we are supposed to hug Ilhan Omar, and we're supposed to admire Linda Sarsour for being a feminist hero.
The word is intersectionality.
Yeah, intersectionality is just one great big lie, according to which you cannot criticize anyone but the West. This is intersectionality is like an inverted mirror. But I was thinking, how far did the imams you took to Israel, how far were you able to move them? What were their views of Israel? Because I looked at the pictures and they look pretty hardcore, at least for an Israeli eye. So what were their views before they came here, and what changed after you took them here?
Yeah, to be fair to the imams, the beauty is that they're all mainstream Orthodox Sunni Muslims. Their appearance is, they're not Islamists, they're not in any way hardliners, but what they had were questions from their congregations about why they went to Israel, and their justification was 1, to fact find, 2, to promote peace, and 3, to recognize the fact that these are children of Abraham and we ought to be in alliance with them. But I think that the imams and also our Gulf Arab allies, and this is really where intersectionality and the nonsense of the far left doesn't work, and this is why those of us in the religious and also in the politically center-right space aren't being vocal enough, is that the imams, as well as small c conservatives around the world, are aligned because they have a set of values that they wish to preserve from the past. They have an Edmund Burkean worldview that we are inheritors of a sacred tradition, be it secular or be it religious, and we have a responsibility to preserve and conserve the best of the West, the best of civilization, and to pass it on to our children. The left doesn't believe in any of that. It's just a resistance and destruction mindset. To me, it's inconceivable that you could be a credible Muslim or a credible Jew who understands that heritage of what we've inherited, wish to pass it on to our children, and then be an intersectional feminist or an intersectional Marxist. It's just a complete clash in your own mind. And that's what the imams and our Muslim conservative friends in the Arab world understand. They're monarchists. They're capitalists. They believe in institutions, and they believe in the sanctity of the past, which they wish to conserve, hence conservative, and then bequeath this to a future generation. You lose that, and you end up in that kind of Edward Saidi, Karl Marxian, Sartrean, madness, which is the intersectional space and the damage that it does to our minds. So the moment you link conservatism, but also our religious heritage, you're in this space where, of course, Israel has every right to exist. Israel is the first idea of the one God and the nation state, and preserving a people's set of ideas, and preserving family life, and preserving a sense of justice. And all of those ideas we take from what's called the Judeo-Christian heritage, right? You lose that, what are we left with? We're left with the destruction of, forgive me, but self-hating Jews like Karl Marx, because that's what he was. He was someone who was from Jewish background, from a rabbinical family, but despised everything that he stood for, and took the worst from Hegel and gave us this destructive mindset that led to the killing of over 60 million people in the last century.
Your references to political philosophy there just reminded me something I forgot about, that you were doing a PhD with Roger Scruton. First of all, my condolences with respect to his death. And did you ever finish that PhD? And if not, what are you going to do?
My final year, it's ongoing. But which reminds me again of another point, that Maimonides, I reference Maimonides in my thesis, is another great Jewish rabbi who went from many Muslim affairs and then ultimately to Egypt. So no, in response to your question, yes, it's ongoing. It's my final year. I should finish it, but but I'm loath to say it's finished, because it's not until you've had the viva and you've been signed off. I'm not there yet. So as you know, Mike, these things are, one requires patience.
I just broke one of my cardinal rules, which is never ask anyone how their PhD or their book is going. So,
so thank you for your condolences, Sir Roger. Great man, and we miss him deeply. But those ideas of conserving and defining conservatism, we learned immensely from him on that front of understanding that history and those set of ideas and what it means for the future.
So those kind of imams with which you visited Israel are the same kind of people who threw you out of mosques when you were a radical Islamist? Because that was an amazing anecdote in an interview I saw with you.
Yes, because they didn't like the concept of young Muslims, A, coming into the mosque, B, telling them what Islam was, and C, saying we've got to fight against the British system, and D, we've got to fight jihad against the Israelis. And what kind of Islam is this in our mosques? So they
So
wanted
you were
us out.
physically kicked out? That was what I wanted to ask you.
Yes.
Physically,
No,
they just
physically
removed you.
Yeah, they ended our circle, said, no, this is it. You are not allowed here. You're not welcome. If you stay here, we'll call the police. And our response, I was 19, 20. I mean, our response was, we'll call the police. And I said, they said, but you don't believe in the British state. Why would you call the British police on us? We'll tell you what, we'll call the police on you because you're the ones who aren't, welcome in an institution that's committed to peace. And by the way, that's, to this day, the good news is most mosques are still in that space. But the Muslim third holy space, as many call it, in Al-Aqsa, is not in that space. Isn't that strange that Hizb ut-Tahrir can organize openly in your country, Gadi, and call for the destruction of Israel? But here, imams banned us from the mosques.
Oh, and we also have the Joint Arab List, it's called. All the representatives of the Arab sector refuse to recognize the right of Jews to self-determination. This is actually illegal formally in Israel, but Israel's Supreme Court forces us to be tolerant enough to tolerate the intolerant. And I wish more of them had your views, because I think what the state of Israel is doing by this is that it encourages radicalism instead of encouraging the Israelization of Arab Muslims, many of which describe themselves on a good day as patriots. It's amazing if you look at the separation, because they vote for radical anti-Israeli parties, but usually half not only tolerate Israel, but describe themselves as patriotic. That is a stunning discovery. And it's not a blip on the graph. It's an ongoing process for decades.
Can I just give you an anecdote of a young man we met in Jerusalem? The imams insisted that they meet more Palestinians, although we've taken them to the West Bank, but anyway, they wanted to meet more on the very last night. So we arranged for 3 young Palestinians, all under the age of 30, to come and meet our imams. And one of them, surprise, surprise, was the great-grandson of Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Because the Husseini family is still there in Jerusalem, large family. We didn't anticipate that. So he introduced himself as that to our imams, and our imams said, Hajj, because they'd been to Yad Vashem, you see.
So they know him through his alliance with the Nazis.
Absolutely. So this is the beauty of taking people to Israel. They see what the history is, and they saw Hajj Amin al-Husseini dressed like the imams were dressed, but sat with Adolf Hitler. So they were in a state of shock. So when they met, and this wasn't in any way choreographed, it just so happened this gentleman came and said, I'm the grandson of Hajj Amin al-Husseini. And so they thought, this is greatly authentic, and all that. So this guy sits down, and the first thing the imams say is, has your family issued an apology on behalf of your great-grandfather and what he did, and therefore, help the Palestinian cause move forward? And the young man was in complete shock. He said, no, we'd never do such a thing, because it's tatbi'a, it's normalization, and we can't recognize the aggressor. And all of the imams turned around and said that's exactly your first step. You've got to undo that damage in order to have a serious and open conversation with the Israelis and say, look, we're sorry. We got this wrong. We're allied with the wrong people, and we're sorry. So that kind of recognition is what the imams were asking for from ordinary Palestinians. And I should say, in fairness to this young man, by the end of the conversation, we were together for about 2 hours. By the end of that evening, he was exactly where we were, and he understood. And he said, and his other friends who worked for a Palestinian NGO said, would we help them move forward in this conversation of how to normalize perceptions, not relations, because they're not quite there yet, but perceptions, and humanize Palestinians more? We were open to it, but I think he was then subsequently vetoed by people in Ramallah from having these conversations. That's why I genuinely believe there's momentum and hope among younger people that they just don't want the old fights.
Mike, I now see that the mistake was sending Dennis Ross here instead of Ed Husain. It would have been much more realistic and helpful.
All right, so listen, that's not a bad suggestion. And on that note, I think we should probably wrap it up. Ed, we will make you the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian normalization.
I think that's for my old boss, Tony Blair, not for me. I think, there are lots of other willing candidates.
Okay, well,
Finish your
hopefully-
PhD first, Ed.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, good idea.
All right, listen, Ed, this has been really fascinating, and thank you for
was.
giving us so much of your time. And
Great to talk with you, and thank you for doing this. Very important to kind of have the space to talk freely without kind of interruptions and people who have an understanding of the region. So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Gadi.
And let's do it again soon, huh, Mike? What do you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Our
What do you say, Ed?
interfaith committee.
Yeah, well,
mean-
I mean, it's a beautiful thing to have a Catholic, a Muslim, and a Jew come together and bash the liberal Jews. This is
All right.
all right.
Let's do it
Okay.
again soon. Great.
Good night, guys.
All right. So,
Thank you.
an interfaith farewell to all of you. Bye.
Peace.
Salam. Salamat. Shalom.
Salam.